Welcome to this week's lecture. We are looking at the second part of the disaster management planning process. So if you recall, in the last lecture, we looked a lot at different types of mutual aid legislation. So I just want to talk briefly about disaster management legislation in general and what is the purpose behind it. So if you recall, disaster management is a massive undertaking. Legislation is often required in order to ensure certain types of behaviors and certain types of things are done. It's often made mandatory, and associated with it would be penalties and oftentimes jail time when persons or groups are in violation of this legislation. And the purpose of the legislation, as I mentioned before, is to ensure and enforce certain types of necessary behavior. So when it comes to disaster management, that is the purpose behind it. Here on the screen, we have a pyramid that is really specifically related to workplace and OSH, occupational safety and health issues, but the principles remain the same. At the very top, we find legislation will have an overarching role to play. Legislation is going to define regulations or the way in which we do something, certain types of behavior that are required. Codes of practice would be derived from regulations, and then of course standards of certain types of behavior and industry practices. So let's look again in some details at legislation. So legislation is a formal basis for achieving your disaster management objectives. It happens at the national or governmental level, where the legislation is developed and passed and implemented. Legislation is imperative in regions that are susceptible to disaster or that are at high risk for disaster. It ensures sound, comprehensive, preventative and responsive measures, as well as capacity building in these vulnerable areas. Legislation, as I mentioned before, also facilitates the development of guidelines or procedures that are necessary in certain areas such as legal, administrative, financial, and institutional organizations that have an impact on the management of any disaster. Some examples of legislation across the world that address disaster management: the Federal Disaster Relief Program in the US. Another US example, Disaster Relief Act, which was actually intended to update the previous act. Also, we would all be familiar with the 2005 Hurricane Katrina disaster in the US. Coming out of that was the Emergency Management Reform Act. Right here in our region in St. Lucia, we have the Disaster Management Act. And in Trinidad, we actually have a number of important pieces of legislation that contribute towards the management of disaster management in our country. For example, we have the Disaster Measures Act, and we also have the Environmental Management Act, of course, which is implemented by the Environmental Management Authority, and their focus would be on environmental disasters. But we also have other agencies that play a major role in terms of managing disasters. For example, we have the Town and Country Planning Act, and as a result, Town and Country Planning Division plays a major role in terms of wise and appropriate land use planning in order to mitigate and minimize the risk of disasters resulting from poor land use. Regulations, as I mentioned, are actually derived from legislation. Regulations are defined as a rule or procedure designed to control the conduct of those involved in disaster management. It is a process or a way of monitoring or enforcing rules established by law. For example, some of these regulations would be regulations governing how different teams participate in disaster management. So some very specific examples: regulations on how to activate an emergency plan during and outside working hours, how to ensure security of equipment, records, etc. during and following an emergency. Other examples may include how to ensure continuity of operations during and after an emergency, how to ensure continuity of communications, as well as how to ensure emergency attendance to injured persons. As mentioned before, our National Response Framework is an example of regulations designed to guide preparation and response in case of disaster in Trinidad and Tobago. In this slide, I have a brief summary of the regulations provided in this document, the National Response Framework. So the National Response Framework, it outlines an overarching goal, objective, and principles that enable all response partners in Trinidad and Tobago to prepare for and provide a unified and integrated national response to disasters and emergencies, from the smallest emergency to the largest emergency. It also addresses the hazards and the vulnerabilities that are most concerned to Trinidad and Tobago. For example, we're talking about earthquakes, hurricanes, industrial accidents because of our heavy petroleum industry, tsunamis because of our geographic location and the fact that we are small islands. Additionally, this National Response Framework defines what constitutes an emergency, and these emergencies have been categorized into different levels. We essentially have 3 levels. We have the local level, regional level, and a national level. And the framework also helps to determine what is an appropriate response for each of those levels. The framework also looks at the structure of all the agencies involved and what their responsibilities should be. If you recall, in the previous lecture, we had a nice chart where all the agencies and their various involvements was nicely organized for us. So let's look briefly at codes. Codes also derive out of regulations, and they have the same purpose as regulations, which is to maintain the objectives of the legislation. So disaster codes provide practical, easy to understand rules for guidance and advice on how to achieve the minimum standards and objectives required by legislation and regulations. Codes are not law, but they must be followed unless you have an alternative course of action. Codes would differ from sector to sector, discipline to discipline, so you do not have a one-size-fits-all type of code. It depends on a particular hazard and particular situation. Codes, even though they are not legal, they are not law, they may be used as evidence in legal proceedings. So as I mentioned, codes are derived from regulations. Many times you find regulations would be very large, extensive documents, and in times of emergency you would find that it's difficult and even almost impractical for you to go back to that large document to find out how to respond in an emergency. As a result, codes simplify that information, very easy to understand, very quick to respond. Let's look at an example. Here we have some codes that have been designed to determine the kind of response needed for certain levels of flooding incidents. We have 3 levels of flooding incidents. We have yellow, orange, and red. Yellow being the lowest grade of flooding, red being the worst. Let us look at the instance of the red warning. Where you have red warning, we have certain conditions that would be associated with that. For example, you have more than 30 millimeters of rain observed in 1 hour and expected to continue for the next 2 hours. Associated with that, we can expect serious flooding occurring in low-lying areas. Where these conditions occur, a community is expected to evacuate. Let us look briefly at business impact analysis, or in other words, vulnerability analysis. So a simple definition of vulnerability analysis is a systematic examination of a situation or an environment. So you'd want to examine the environment to determine in what areas are their strengths in terms of coping with a certain type of hazard, and where are the weaknesses. Once you've made that evaluation and determination, you're not doing that in a vacuum. You're doing that for the purpose of determining how can I improve. Hence the reason for wanting to know your areas of deficiency. Let us look at exactly how vulnerability is involved in disaster. What is the role of vulnerability and why vulnerability analysis would be important? So as mentioned before, a disaster is not a hazard. A disaster occurs as a result of the convergence of certain conditions and situations coming together in order to create a situation of harm and danger to persons' lives, property, and the environment. So if you follow with me here, we see that where a hazard occurs in a situation or in a geographic location that is highly vulnerable to a particular type of hazard, and the capacity of that environment is not strong to cope with the hazard, a disaster is likely to occur. Hence, we define a disaster as vulnerability plus hazard divided by capacity equals disaster. We have a number of disasters that can occur, for example, hazards that can occur. For example, we have earthquakes, droughts, flooding, conflict, and hurricanes. These are just a few. Where we have hazards that can occur in a particular location, and we have certain underlying conditions that actually reduce the capacity of that environment to cope. For example, there may be poverty, limited resources in a community. You may have large poor populations. The environment may be degraded, such as poor soils, etc. And then the community occurs in a location that is highly vulnerable. For example, the community may be on a floodplain, so they are highly vulnerable to flooding. All of these will converge together to create a situation of disaster. Here I have an example of a hazard vulnerability analysis worksheet. This can be used in any organization or even modified for a community in order to make a determination as to the levels of vulnerability and in what areas those vulnerability occurs in order for disaster planning. For example, we have a rating scale of 1 to 5. 1 being the least likely that a certain type of hazard would occur, or 5 being the highest possibility that it would occur. At the top we see a number of different areas that would be considered for impact. On the left we have a list of different types of emergencies. So for example, an emergency may be acts of terrorism. You will need to determine what kind of vulnerability this terrorism can have. What is the probability of it occurring? Is it 1, 2, 3, or 5, 4 or 5? What is the vulnerability or the probability, sorry, of terrorism having a the impact on humans, impact on property, business, your internal and external resources. And once you've completed this for all the various listed emergencies, you can total and compare for each of the emergencies, as well as have a summary figure in order to make a determination as to how to move forward for your disaster management plan. Every disaster management plan, be it for an organization or for a community, must have certain critical information presented. Firstly, you would want to ensure that the composition of your planning team, disaster management team, must be clearly identified. Who should be there? What are their responsibilities? That must be very clear. There must be no ambiguity or opportunity for confusion. Remember, we do not want to have persons working at cross purposes. You must also in your plan identify your critical organizational or business functions. So critical functions should identify the priority business functions, particularly during and after disaster. For example, if you're a company that provides electrical power service, your critical function would be the provision of electrical power. So that must be clearly identified. This would be a priority for you, because when you try to bring your business operations back immediately during and after an emergency, this must be one of the first functions that need attention. Your plan should also indicate what your normal business hours are. Your hours of operation must be stated for the primary and alternate locations. Alternate being if your business operations need to be temporarily moved elsewhere. What are your normal hours? Notification. Contact information for all departments and employees should be compiled and attached to the plan. This information is critical for the dissemination of information throughout the organization, particularly in times of emergency. You also need corporate headquarters phone numbers. This is a list of all contact numbers for personnel at head office, and this should also be concluded, because remember, many times these are the people who would be in a decision-making position, so they need to be contacted in times of emergency so that decisions can be made quickly. Suppliers and contractors. Contact information for suppliers and contractors also need to be included. For many times during emergencies, you find that you would need emergency supplies if your objective is to bring your operations back up to a certain level in order to continue to provide that critical function or critical product that you need to produce during and after the emergency. You will need emergency supplies, so you need to have this information ready and handy for when you need it. Your disaster management plan must also have an evacuation plan contained within. This plan should include a warning system. What types of warning systems do you have or do you need to put in place, such as alarms, weather bulletins, etc. You must also have designated assembly sites. Everyone in the organization must know where these assembly sites are, or as many of us know them as muster points, if an evacuation needs to take place. you must have assembly sites or must appoint managers and a backup person in case that person happens to not be available on the day of the emergency. You must have a shutdown manager and a backup person, an alternate. The shutdown manager is effectively the last person who would leave the premises or the facilities. They may often, especially in terms of highly technical environments, they may be required to shut off power, etc. And each of these responsibilities must be clearly identified, again, so that there is no ambiguity and no confusion in terms of people knowing what they have to do and who has to do it. Your plan should include shelter location, emergency shelters location, and again also an alternative. But sometimes the scale of the emergency does not make it feasible to use one location. You may have to use an emergency shelter further away, out of the area of risk. Your disaster management plan should also include a communication plan, an emergency communication plan, and this must detail the plan or the arrangements and facilities that you have in place in order to communicate with co-workers and employees during times of emergency. Cybersecurity must also be addressed in your disaster management plan. It must detail the methods that you have in place for protecting computer hardware and software, especially in case of destruction. Do you have a plan for backup? How are you backing up your records? How do you protect your computers, for example? If flooding is the hazard risk, how do you protect your hardware and software? Records backup. As mentioned before, it is critical to have a backup plan, a records backup plan, to back up your critical records. Any business or even on a personal level, it's important that you have all your important records safely put away somewhere or have copies of it. For example, identification of persons and or departments responsible for handling the critical records. Who are they? For example, in a business setting, it may be payroll and accounting. Just imagine if in a hazard situation, you're working in an organization and there was no backup system in place and all your payroll records have been lost. You receiving your salaries now become a big problem. So this is a critical service that must be provided. Other types of critical records that would need to be backed up or copied would be the disaster management plan itself, site maps, insurance policies, bank account records, etc. And then lastly, your plan must include provision for an annual review of your plan. And the purpose of that review again is to identify areas that are working, areas that are not working, so that improvements and adjustments can be made. And this should be done at least annually. So that concludes our lesson for this week. Again, thank you for your time, and please proceed to the activities on the eClassroom page that have been provided.